I'm going to make an apology straight away, because the fact is, I'm going to be really forward, because I'd like to take you all on a date. And there is a point to this. Oh, hello. Yes, there is a point to romantic engagement, because essentially, I want you to really feel it. I want to essentially provide a sensory experience for you today, because I want you to think about having an incredible dinner. With me, obviously, that's the plus point, obviously. But the fact is that you can almost see this incredible view. You can, if you inhale really deeply, you can have the kind of sense of red wine and warm desserts in the air. There's an incredible atmosphere within the dinner. And essentially, you're set across from me, so hopefully that's a plus point. I'm not sure whether it sounds a bit forward, but what I'd like to talk about is the communication and our interaction with each other. But the fact is when it comes to it, is that when I'm talking to you, and I stand here talking to you today, and also the fact is over this dinner table, is that the interaction between us is quite intimate. Well, I hope it's so, because it is a date. But all the stuff that I'm essentially talking to you about, and how communication is essentially worked out, is that 7% of everything I say is the words in which I choose to use with you. The words and the vocabulary. To be fair, if you've got a good vocabulary, you've already got me halfway into bed. But the fact is that actually words is actually a very small part of that. 38% are the voice qualities and the voice intonations, resonance, etc. when you're speaking, but also when you're kind of... Because very often with a friend, a colleague, a loved one, very often you can pick up very much subconsciously anything that they've ended up saying, how they're feeling. Okay, I'm fine. How much weight is to essentially affixed to I'm fine because of the voice quality that goes with it. But the biggest one is 55% is physiology. So the body language, I can say as much or as little as I like, etc., and with words and voices, but actually 55% is your body language, how you hold yourself, and etc. 55% is me sat there quivering in your ravishing beauty across the dinner table. Voice qualities is me quivering and having a dry mouth, etc., when you're public speaking or whatever it may be. But what my point is that when it comes to communication interaction, and especially in whatever level, is that it's very emotional. We essentially want to key into everybody's feelings and how anybody, and that kind of empathy is something that is quite natural and quite instinctive. So 93% of all communication that we choose to use is essentially unconscious in pretty much every way. Now with that 93% is that we fill that with a lot of our own baggage. And to be fair, most of us have more baggage than Heathrow Airport, yet we want to admit it or not. But we fill up that 93%. Whether it's anxiety, depression, happiness, excitement, you will interpret things the way you want to interpret it. So if I switch this, and what I really want to say is that actually most people have an emotional barrier in relation to technology. So if I switch this and say, well, actually 93% is our own baggage and how we interpret things, and that's subjective interpretation, what are we entirely reliant on for communication? Whether it's romantic, professional, engaging with an organization, emails, social media, whichever, is that we are essentially reliant on 7%. The written word, words, documentation, because essentially, unless it's a video content, very often you're completely lax of the other 93%. So what do? We ship our own baggage and we read the things we want to read. So that text message, have you ever taken a text message the wrong way from a partner or a boyfriend, girlfriend, or whichever? Have you ever taken an email the wrong way from a colleague that you think she's a right bitch? But the fact is, or whatever it may be, is whatever the context, you will read something in the way you want to read it. So we are entirely reliant on a platform, from mobile phones to emails to devices, our internal culture, our relationships, both romantic and professional, on 7% of subjective interpretation. Now, when it comes to tech, is that what I want to really think about is how this affects our narrative. Now, your narrative in which you talk, your story in which you tell yourself, is incredibly important to both your mental health, your internal work culture, and your general being, because what you tell yourself is what you believe. And the problem is when we're reliant on communication and interaction purely on a digital or technological device, is that you subjectively interpret with your own baggage. So, what I want you to understand is that emotional barrier to technology is we are too busy separating technology from our own bodies, our own emotions, our own feelings, and our own relationships, because the fact is we are all in an office where we have a manager, a co-worker, that will continue to type when you go and engage with them. They'll be looking at their screen. You may be one of them. We're all guilty of it. When you go into a meeting, etc., like that, as soon as I go into a meeting, the amount of people that end up putting their phone on the table straight in front of them. But what does that instigate? Because as soon as that goes off, this is more important to me than you are. It's like planting a flag of kind of narcissism, and it's like, actually, this is much more important than you. But we all do it. Restaurants, dinner tables, anything like that. And you've heard this all before, but I would go a little bit further, because you're sat in bed with your partner and you're looking at this rather than each other. I have a bit of a policy where I don't allow tech into my room, but as cyber risk and a technologist, etc., like that, then I'd be a big hypocrite if I turn around to you and say, stop using technology. But it's about finding a balance. It's about understanding how this affects you, because we have a mental health epidemic within the Western world because of these, and because of tech, and because we're not geared for that subjective interpretation. But it's about understanding this internalized feeling that we have. Now, Simon Sinek talks a lot about this, is that he says it on station, because as soon as I hold this, all of a sudden you get a little feeling in the center of your stomach that actually if this goes off, I'm much more distracted by this. But I would go along a step further and say, well, actually, there's a feeling that you get, this is almost socially accepted, ignored. Socially accepted drug that everybody essentially has, and pick up this little fruit machine that's in your pocket, and you feel it when your loved one is looking at your phone rather than you, or whatever. But we have a real go at our new millennial generation, and as your resident elder millennial snowflake, whatever you want to call me, but actually in reality is that we have a go at our young people in relation to spending so much time on social media, but most of the time, or gaming or whatever it is, but most of the time I ask parents especially, when do you turn off your work emails? When do you stop? When do you end up putting down the news or whichever? Why is that any different considering who you are paying attention to? Because what it is degrading, and again, I would be a hypocrite if I said to get rid of technology, but it's about finding balance, because it is degrading our empathy. We're not looking at each other. Empathy, especially both professionally and romantically and friendships, is that it takes practice. You have to look at people. You have to listen to people. You have to look out for that 93% of unconscious aspects, because you can't see it if you're looking at a phone, and you can't see it if you're reading it. Even with a video, it's very difficult to do so. So as families, as culture, as businesses, we all need to essentially have a little mindful moment where we're saying, well, actually, okay, well, I've brought in a policy for Dardan that everybody puts their phone in a little wicker basket before you go into a meeting, which has changed the meeting dynamic tenfold. But what it's also changed is our expectations of one another. Our expectations is that if you send an email to a client, to a co-worker, you expect a response. If you send a text message, if you're online dating, etc., you get this anxiety and this build-up of this understanding that actually I expect a response from somebody. Would you believe that if anybody else expected you with that response, do you always have to reply straight away? Because I'm pretty sure, I remember the advert that came out when text messages first came about, that actually the whole point of it was to avoid a phone call that I could text you and give you the information and you didn't have to get back to me. But this is the difference. It now has an entirely social, constructed anxiety around being left on red. Those two little blue ticks of doom. Essentially in WhatsApp, that actually people have an expectation that I should be responded to. Even in a workplace. I expect you to respond to an email rather than me walk to the other end of the room and actually have a conversation with you. But the biggest one as well I want to really look at is there's a big correlation between the launch of things like mindfulness, meditation. Juliana mentioned Headspace and these apps that are worth absolutely millions because there is such a place for it in the market because nobody stops anymore. I'd like to ask you a question. When was the last time you were bored? Because I remember back in the summer holidays when I was at school, etc., the amount of times my mum would probably want to hit me because the amount of times they're saying I'm bored. But I don't hear anybody saying I'm bored anymore. Because the fact is, there's a correlation between mindfulness because boredom brought about a creativity. You had to figure out what you were going to do. You had to figure out an opportunity or a solution to something. Whether you sat on the loo, for Christ's sake, nowadays you've got your phone with you normally for most people. Whether you think that's disgusting or not, most people around you, I'd say for a good 75% do it. But the fact is we're no longer bored. And those natural, mindful and creative moments are no longer there. Boredom has now become a trigger to pick this up. How often you sat on the sofa with your loved ones watching a movie and all of you on this instead of actually watching the movie? But it's about understanding that our relationships and our emotional barrier to whether it's adopting technology or our culture within the business is essentially all of the same, and it's essentially altering our relationships. Technology hasn't moved to meet how we function, we have changed to meet it. But our relationship with technology is not the enemy. Essentially, it's essentially the balance between the two. So it's about understanding that. How are you doing for time? I didn't actually look. I never look. So it's about understanding that, again, is that going back to that kind of 7% rule, all I want you to think about is that, because I'm essentially a really weird kind of vanilla Marvel superhero because I talk about cyber risk and technology and security and things like that, just like my kind of colleagues that were up here before. But actually very often is that I kind of end up talking about digital well-being and relationships and how tech has changed us. Because essentially, tech for most people, 99% of people, is witchcraft and mysticism. There are so many myths around it, but we separate that technology from ourselves. You've got your phone in your bedside table, etc. Is that very often when you pick up that phone, it is that fruit machine, that constant little regurgitation of information. Social media feeds, news feeds, work emails, all these things, we are essentially triggered to pull that lever every time we pick it up. But if it creates the same stuff like dopamine and neurotransmitters that alcohol and drugs and gambling does, is that essentially you've now got your phone on your bedside table. If I turn around to you and say, okay, well, you're an alcoholic, and I'm going to place a bottle of Jack Daniels on your bedside table at all times, would you trust yourself not to touch it? Probably not. Because the fact is every time, I'd be willing to bet you touch your phone before you've opened your eyes in the morning, and you're already scrolling through whatever it may be, whether it's work emails or social media. So, if you're going to take anything away, start finding that balance. Even if just say 7% rule, if you're taking a text the wrong way. If you're having an argument over text or an email, if you're having an argument over text, email, or social media, you've already lost. So it's about understanding that essentially you're interpreting it. It's understanding that you need that balance. Thank you very much, everybody.